Next, I'd like to introduce Majora Carter. Majora Carter is not from Texas, but she got here as quickly as she could on a flight out of JFK Airport this morning. She's an urban revitalization strategist, and she works to address the disproportionate impact of environmental change and public health experienced by underrepresented populations. She's done this most notably where she grew up in the South Bronx. Majora is a Peabody Award-winning communicator, and she's also a recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, which is also known as the Genius Award. Please help me welcome Majora Carter.
It's true, I'm not from around here, so I bring you greetings from the boogie down. And that, for those of you that don't know, is ghetto parlance for the South Bronx in New York City. So thank you for having me, Austin. So cool. So, and look, I will admit I do not know much about Texas, but I did learn a few things over the course of being invited here. One is that Texas is actually home to some of America's largest cities, which I didn't know. I was like, there's more large cities here in Texas than there are collectively in every other state in the union, so that's kind of cool. And then also, of course, Harvey kind of made it really clear that you're also home to an extraordinary amount of natural disasters. And I think what you share with all people in America and actually around the world is that Texans react to the environment in serious ways. And I think it's easy, frankly, for us to be kind of dumbstruck when a natural disaster hits, because it's a scary moment that seems completely out of our control. There are wildfires and hurricanes and floods, and yes, it hits you like where it hurts the most. I mean, your property is damaged, people die or injured, and it's real to everybody. And that's, I think, when we most really notice the environment in ways that don't feel so good. But disasters may be on the rise, but thankfully, we don't get them every week, right? All year long, consistently for generations. But in American cities, it is the built environment that affects us all day, every day. And for better or for worse, and for example, the Chicago heat wave was both an example of a natural disaster, and at least in one instance, and I would argue, an unnaturally needless disaster because of the built environment. So back in 1995, huge heat wave, one of the worst on record in American history. Huge amounts of people died. There was a researcher whose name, I'm sorry, I forgot, did this study of these two equally low status, very poor communities of color in Chicago. And it was interesting because one of those communities had this extraordinarily high mortality rate and the other one did not. And the only thing that was different was the mortality rate, because they were both equally poor. But what was interesting was that in one of the communities that had the lower mortality rate was that there was all of these interesting ways where people got a chance to be socially interactive. There were these rather informal markets where people would sell like odds and ends and produce and stuff like that. And there was, not a great kind of commercial sector, but it was there that people would go to shop and on a daily basis or weekly basis. So frankly, when the heat wave hit, people noticed when Mr. Sanchez didn't show up, or when Miss Johnson wasn't around, and they would go look for those people. So that the built environment in and of itself was the actual social cohesiveness that allowed those communities to see each other, literally see each other and care for each other. And that's why less people died in that area versus the place that didn't have those pieces of infrastructure, of the built environment that allowed people to create a socially cohesive area. So the same exact natural disaster The 1995 Chicago heat wave affected two very similar communities, but in very different ways, because what we experienced there was this thing called a sort of slow pace of disasters that happen with the built environment of low status communities all the time, every day. So that is what I refer to as a storm of inequality. And you know when you're in the hood, and you know when you're not in the hood. And what's interesting about being in the hood is that and what sort of flies in the face of what people think about people in the hood is that folks in the hood have very different perspectives than what is commonly expected of them. In particular, poor folks don't really want to be around exclusively poor folks. They just don't, because they know a couple things based on being in a community like that. So clearly, I'm like the social scientist out of the folks that have been on the stage. So it's like, I think we're gonna have like a really great conversation in a few minutes. But this was a survey, or at least a few of the questions that we did in a survey, based on the work that we put out there, because I'm a real estate developer. I do community development, and I wanted to really just check the temperature and the pulse of what people wanted, in the community that is essentially my research and development lab, which also happens to be my hometown of the South Bronx in New York City. So we wanted to find out, what did people actually really think about the idea of their own community? And guess what? People were like, you know what? We overwhelmingly, according to the survey that we did, which was more than 500 people, in a neighborhood that has about 13,000 in it, we were able to get things like, people wanted to see more folks with different and higher, educational and income levels in their community. They knew they were treated badly in terms of goods and services because they were a poor community. And they wanted to see more of a community that actually had mixed incomes, people living in it. And so this, I thought, was a really interesting kind of thing, because guess what? People wanted to see the same kind of things that, in a poor neighborhood that they saw in other neighborhoods. So this idea that poverty is this cultural attribute that we need, as a society that's interested in creating justice, that we should sort of protect and preserve the poverty of people. They were like, no, we kind of want cool stuff too, straight up. Duh. So with all that, it was clear for us to understand that when you look at these nice little things that people want, kind of makes sense, right? But in my work, in working around the country, and also in my own community, I realized that there's only two kinds of real estate development. There's a typical kind of gentrification, model that everybody knows is like, oh, there's a poor neighborhood, and then, speculators and developers look at it and realize the value of it, and then, they eventually displace all the poor folks that are in it. That's the model that's out there, right? But then there's this other model that we also know, and we call it poverty level economic maintenance. Somebody's making money from all this stuff, but it's certainly not benefiting the people that are there, especially those that are looking for like the kind of affordable, healthy meal that's actually going to nourish their body as opposed to poison it. These are the kind of economic developments that, if you've got a decent public transportation system, you can go elsewhere and get like the kind of things that you really want in your community. I'm a girl who loves a bargain as much as everybody else, but I kind of wish that there weren't 3 different 99-cent stores within a 2-block radius within my neighborhood. And you can always find ways, in these low-status communities where you can actually be legitimately medicated or self-medicated. Lots of things like that. And then, if you want to save money, also incredibly hard to do in places where there's a regressive tax on being a poor person, with all you can find are check cashing stores, rent-a-centers, and payday loan places and pawn shops. So no banks or credit unions or things like that. And last but definitely not least, you find things like huge quantities of super highly subsidized affordable housing. And so before anybody starts a little Twitter rant about Majora Carter that really hates poor people and doesn't like poor communities, that's not what I'm saying. But what I will tell you without a shadow of a doubt, and research will back me up on this, is that when you concentrate all the things that I just showed you, you also concentrate the effects of poverty. from reduced rates of economic development and educational attainment to the worst rates of health outcomes, obviously generational poverty, higher rates of incarceration. All those things are attached to places like this. These are the kind of places where we're absolutely told that you want to be somebody in a place like this, you have to grow up and get out of a place like this. That's what happens there. And honestly, just because you don't see any value in a place like this doesn't mean that other people don't. These are actual real examples of the kind of notices that I get under my door, because I own my own property in my neighborhood that I was born and raised in, by folks who either pick up the phone and call me, and I don't know how they get my cell phone number, or they get these notices under the door that are mailed to me asking me to sell my house for cash, because they are in fact counting on the fact that people in low status communities definitely don't see any real value in it. Because the bottom line is gentrification does not just happen when you start to see white people moving into a formerly community of color, or the doggy daycares move in. It happens when we tell the smart, hardworking kids in those communities that in order to be somebody, they have to grow up and get out of that place. When we tell those young people we need to measure success by how far they get away from those communities, that's when gentrification starts. That's what makes it so easy for folks in communities like this to sell their homes, their property early and cheap. Because again, someone else sees the value of it and they're counting on it. So what we do know is that when we started asking around, what it was clear to us was that folks really wanted quality, straight up quality. They wanted year-round social gathering and the kind of beautiful built environments that said to them, these are not the markers of a poor community. They really wanted more than that. They wanted to know that where they were was a part of the larger term of economic drivers in a community. So it produces jobs and businesses, and also reduce brain drain. Because we would see our communities would hemorrhage, and this is all over the country. The low status communities hemorrhage talent. If we're taught that there's no value there, so if you are a smart one, you get on out of there. That's brain drain. It doesn't just happen in the developing world. It happens in America's low status communities all over this country, and of every single color, mind you. And also, no one, again, the markers of being a poor community, a developer comes in and builds a building, and then they put a community center in it. I have never, in all of my years doing this work, I have never met someone from a low status community moving and being able to move up and on and out of them, going to another community where there were more community centers. They go to places where there are bars and restaurants and cool bookstores and stuff like that. Community center never mentions in the conversation. And they want to feel good about themselves. So our approach to urbanization is using environmental equality lens and applying it to our approach to community real estate development, which is all about retaining talent. So the folks that we spoke to and that responded to our surveys and focus groups really said they wanted those kind of like really cool third spaces that allowed them to feel like they weren't in a poor community, that made them feel kind of stickiness. They wanted to be in a community because it wasn't like they hated our communities, but they felt like there weren't reasons to stay. And it was mostly came down to lifestyle infrastructure. So one of the things we did was actually open up a coffee shop because we knew people were leaving the neighborhood in order to experience that kind of culture. So we came in a joint venture with a really special pretty high-end coffee shop called Birch Coffee that had their own roast house and then a bunch of different coffee shops, and we went into a joint venture with them. And we were able to open this up in the community. Mind you, our prices were the same as Dunkin' Donuts, but our quality was way higher and also just a really pretty place to be. And it just allowed folks to just sort of see themselves in a way that made them feel like, oh, I could be cool in my own daggone community. Because again, this type of lifestyle infrastructure that came with a really good cup cup of coffee was awesome, and I actually all had to learn how to do all this to myself so I could steam milk expertly, by the way. It's kind of cool. But it's also, what's important here was actually showing the possibility that this was a local business. So we're not just gentrifying, we're actually self-gentrifying, if you want to call it that, because this is one of the only locally owned businesses in this entire community, owned by 2 women of color with collectively 100 years worth of family history in this community. So, and another thing that folks talked about was the idea that, that their talented kids who were going to school and being responsive to the economic drivers in the community, or excuse me, not just in the community, in the world. Technology was a big one. They were watching these young people leave and never returning. And so thinking about that, it was like, okay, so what are the economic drivers? Tech. Tech touches everything in this world. So when it came right down to it, when we think about technology, in particular in low status communities, what we hear a lot of are things like, oh, there's this digital divide, and if people just had access to broadband, then maybe they could be a part of the digital divide. Actually, let me just, no. People in low status communities, I don't care if they're in quote unquote inner city ghettos or on the res or in poor white, formally industrial communities, they have access, whether it's through a smartphone. It may not be the best way, but people have access, to the internet. And we did our own little study in the South Bronx, and then literally the same exact number got it from the Pew Research Center when they did the same study around the same time, which we didn't know, but we felt, really validated. It was awesome. But this is the real digital divide. Are you simply a consumer of technology? Or are you producing it? Are you working in the field? Are you producing it? Are you owning a business? What are you doing? If you're only buying it and waiting on a Mac store line, early in the morning so you can get the cool stuff, then no, you're not really a part of the digital economy. So again, our goal was to figure out how do we help people participate in the tech economy. And in particular, this is really important because American diversity versus tech diversity, it's kind of sucky if any of you have been following it. So American diversity is like we won't as a country be a majority white country probably around 2040, which diversity is an awesome thing, breeds innovation, could be awesome, so psyched about that. But in terms of the tech economy, you would never know that, ever. I mean, if these numbers have gotten even worse since, was it Facebook or Google, I don't even remember who it was like, we're gonna post our diversity numbers, and everybody's are still really bad. I mean, and if you look particularly at the Black and Latino numbers over here, 2% of folks are represented of Black folks are represented in the tech economy right now, yet they represent 4% of all computer science and engineering graduates in America. So clearly, 50% of them are just not being hired. So there is this thing called statistical hiring bias in technology. And look, I know that there probably are some really racist and sexist people in technology. It happens and everything. But I think for the most part, people hire who they know. And so that was something we had to recognize. There is statistical hiring bias, but it isn't necessarily like this malicious thing. It just is what it is. And so what we decided to do was actually decide, instead of trying to force people to diversify the tech talent pipeline, we embraced it on some level. Because we were a small company and that's what we could do. So we started Startup Box as a way to help deal with that. And it was a way specifically to help people participate in the technology economy. And so the first place we did it was, of course, in the South Bronx, because that's my R&D lab, because we knew that this was our talent base. We're starting in a very low status community, so we knew that we were going to get a lot of folks that actually didn't even have a high school diploma. And maybe we'd have some folks that had some experience in the workforce, but we were totally shocked when we saw that there were so many people that were coming to us that did in fact have computer science degrees. But again, we're casualties of the statistical hiring bias. So what we had to look for was a specific way, a market-based solution to enter into the tech economy. We weren't trying to teach kids the code, or make anybody take an intern on that they would feel uncomfortable about. It was just look, we're going to figure out a way so that you would buy a service from us rather than trying to serve this hiring bias kind of need. And so what we discovered was that there was a certain aspect within the software development pipeline where where the software developers were actually offshoring a bit of their work, and it's called quality assurance. And it's like an entry-level part of the software development pipeline. It's literally your testing software, and it's kind of like, think of yourself as a writer, and if you are a writer, and I'm sure there are many in this room, this is Austin after all. If you're a writer, and then you have an editor check your work. Same thing with software developers. You love your work. You need somebody else to look at it to make sure it's hitting the right marks. Same thing for the software developers. Somebody has to test it to make sure that it's hitting those marks. And so much of that software testing, or quality assurance, which is what it's technically called, has been offshored. That used to be an entry-level job for people of a certain age, in the tech economy now. But that's been offshored, India, China, Eastern Europe. But we realized that for a certain segment of the software developing pipeline here, in particular those that did lots of work in folks in the entertainment industry, lots of user interfaces, so whether they were websites with lots of moving parts, or maybe games, or things like that, the cultural fluency that was associated with the Western audience, the time zone differences, it just was not working for folks. And we were like, well, maybe we can create a model that would, a business-to-business model that people might want to buy. So guess what we did? We decided to pilot it. So we supported, several people that we trained and hired, and then we gave away the product to Nickelodeon, which is pretty big company that uses those services, and Trescenza, which is a small one that you've probably never heard of, but you might have played their games. And so we did most of it in the offices of the conference room in my office. And for these folks, we were able to train them up really quickly in a protocol around quality assurance. And then we literally gave away the product to our clients for free. And then we realized, you know what, they loved it. They absolutely loved what we were able to give them. And our clients were really happy with the on-demand, really in their same time zone model that we gave them. And our teammates were really excited that they actually had a job working in the tech industry that also provided them access into the world of, the networks that would eventually allow them to create a career ladder for themselves. And so just to let you know, this was like a big slide to show that the quality assurance market is actually growing a lot by the billions, so it's cool. So then we realized that we, in fact, could and should go out big time. So we were able to rent these two little spaces on the main commercial avenue in the neighborhood, and we were then developed into these places. Now, Startup Box is really important on that corner because, that corner, it was funny because, back in the old days of the South Bronx, that corner was a particularly hot corner, and someone just a few months ago told me that was like, this corner was really hot. Like your roll down gate, there used to be shootouts here, and showed me the bullet holes in them. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. But now we've got like these two big, huge plate glass windows on either side that thousands of people walk by every single day. And when we first opened up Startup Box, we actually had to have each one of our team members literally taking turns answering the door so that the people would come and be like, what is this? And what they would do, they would tell them what quality assurance was and why they were there. But the source of pride that people got from having a tech company in their community and being conducted by Black and brown people who looked just like them, just imagine that sense of pride that they got. We used gaming tournaments as a way to initially recruit people into the world of technology, because we knew that if we went to them and said, we got a job for you, they probably would have felt really demoralized and self-selected out. So instead, what we did was actually do these gaming tournaments to get them in. It was a really good screen to see who was a jerk and who wasn't, because you can see who wins well and who. and who's a sore loser, and you could just see they're comfortable around technology and stuff like that. So that was kind of cool. But then we would approach them and say things like, okay, so you're really good at this, we'd love you to interview for this job. And they were like, sure, cool, why not? And that's how we made our first hires. But the other thing that was so mind-blowing about developing this kind of infrastructure in the community and doing these like non-community center but cool spots was that, we'd host these gaming tournaments and we'd notice that the cops would like hang around. And there's like some tension, I think, if we're American and we could be straight about it, there's some tension between cops and communities of color, right? And so it was duly noted, but it turns out that these cops, and I just understand a lot of cops actually play the same games that these guys do. And so it was awesome. But right after the Eric Garner verdict, and in New York City, that was the police brutality case where the cop who put the guy in a chokehold got completely off. It was tense in New York City, just to say the least. And so our local precinct, and Startup Box got together and was like, what can we do as a community to sort of like ease some tension? So what we decided to do might seem counterintuitive. We decided to host a Call of Duty gaming tournament. Oh, good. So y'all know it's a shooter game. Like, yes, they are shooting each other, but it is virtually, and I am all for virtual guns. That's the only kind I'm for at this point. But what was so cool was that we can say, we can't claim full credit for, but I will absolutely take some, is that out of all of the precincts in the Bronx, ours was the only one that didn't show an increase in negative community and police interactions. Ours was the only one. So I was psyched about that. And our goal is to see Startup Box actually expand and to take this model, because wherever there is a thriving tech and active tech community, there is always another not so thriving, low status community where this model will work. And if you notice, there have been some folks in Austin who've been really interested in actually having a Startup Box Austin. So hopefully y'all might be seeing more of me, which would be super, super cool. And just so that you know now, so that spot that it was located in, which is like right, ground zero, like huge, like storefront visibility. So they've done their job. They're moving to like my conference room in my office, which is just a couple blocks away. And now we're actually doing another lifestyle infrastructure. There's going to be another local woman who's opening up a spin and health and wellness studio in that same spot. So we're super excited about that. And so lastly, bottom line is this quote is from Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And this is one of my favorite lines in the world, because it speaks to how we need to be impatient about building the kind of communities that make us feel like, you know what, we have something to look forward to as Americans. Because we can afford to be generous, we can afford to be gracious, we can afford to be powerful, because we are that innovative. We can do these things, and we can do it with love and humility and hospitality for each other, and we can do it because ultimately we know that we've been through so much worse. We know good and daggone well that the more opportunities that we provide, when we create opportunities for equality, economic development actually happens as a result of it. From the American Revolution to the abolition of slavery to women's suffrage. And now I think as we think about how the environment is going to be changed as well, how urbanization is going to be a part of what we're going to be doing, we really can understand that we absolutely have the ability to show that we don't have to move out of our neighborhoods to live in better ones, and that we can actually create the promise of America in each and every one of Americans' communities. Thank you. Bye.